It is a Tuesday afternoon, roughly 40,000 years ago. The hunt this morning went well. Better than expected, actually. There is more meat than the group needs for today, the fire is going, the weather has stabilized after 3 days of rain, and there is genuinely nothing urgent that needs doing right now. The children are fed, the shelters are sound, the tools that needed repairing have been repaired, the hides that needed processing have been scraped and stretched and are drying in the afternoon light. And you are just sitting there, not meditating, not communing with nature in the romantic way that people imagine ancient humans spending their downtime. Just sitting, with nothing particular to do, watching the fire, occasionally glancing at the person next to you who is also sitting there doing nothing particular. And somewhere in the background, hum of your ancient, modern, fully operational human brain, something stirs. A restlessness. A vague dissatisfaction with the absence of anything to focus on. A low-level internal signal that something should be happening. That the present moment is somehow insufficient. That there must be something more interesting to think about or do or make or explore. In other words, you are bored. And here is the thing that I find genuinely fascinating about this scenario, the thing that makes it worth an entire video. The question of whether ancient humans experience boredom is not a trivial curiosity. It is a window into the deepest questions about what kind of minds ancient humans actually had. Because boredom is not a simple emotion. It is a specific, complex psychological state that requires a particular configuration of cognitive abilities to experience. And understanding whether ancient humans had those abilities and what they did with them tells us something profound about who these people really were. Spoiler: they absolutely got bored. And what they did about it changed the world. Let's start with what boredom actually is, because it is worth understanding precisely before we go looking for it in the ancient past. Boredom is not simply the absence of activity. You can be inactive and not bored. Deep rest, meditation, and the kind of quiet alertness that skilled hunters maintain while waiting are all states of low activity that are not boredom. Boredom is specifically the experience of feeling understimulated relative to what your mind wants or needs. It is the gap between the level of engagement your brain is seeking and the level of engagement your current situation is providing. And critically, this is the part that makes boredom interesting rather than just annoying. Boredom is motivational. It is a drive state like hunger or thirst that pushes you toward action. A bored mind does not stay bored passively. It seeks. It reaches for something more interesting, more engaging, more stimulating. It generates internally the stimulation that the external environment is failing to provide. This is why bored children make up games. Why bored adults daydream, plan, create. Why bored prisoners have produced some of the most remarkable intellectual and creative work in human history. Why Isaac Newton, confined to his family estate during a plague outbreak in 1666 with nothing pressing to do, reportedly watched an apple fall from a tree and started thinking about gravity in a way that changed physics forever. The mind, denied external stimulation, turns its extraordinary generative capacity inward and starts producing its own content. For boredom to exist, you need a specific set of cognitive ingredients. You need a mind that has a baseline expectation of stimulation and engagement, a mind calibrated to expect that things happen, that there is something to attend to and process. You need a mind that can register the gap between that expectation and current reality. You need a mind that generates the motivational push to close that gap. And you need a mind with enough spare cognitive capacity, enough processing power beyond what immediate survival demands, to experience that restlessness in the first place. A mind fully consumed by survival demands every waking moment does not have the spare capacity to be bored. Boredom is, in a paradoxical sense, a luxury. It is what happens when a sufficiently sophisticated mind has handled its immediate needs and finds itself with processing capacity left over. Ancient humans had exactly this kind of mind. Their brains were, neurologically and genetically, identical to modern human brains. They had the same prefrontal cortex, the same default mode network that activates during mind-wandering and self-referential thought, the same capacity for imagination, planning, and the generation of mental content independent of immediate sensory input. They were fully capable of experiencing every psychological state that modern humans experience, including the peculiar, generative restlessness of boredom. And they lived intermittently in conditions that produced it. Here is the part that surprises people. Ancient hunter-gatherer life was not a continuous, exhausting, every waking moment struggle for survival. That image, the noble savage locked in permanent battle with a hostile nature, is more a projection of later cultural anxieties than an accurate picture of what the evidence actually shows. Studies of contemporary hunter-gatherer societies, the groups that provide our best living window into how ancient humans may have structured their time, consistently show that subsistence activities occupy a surprisingly modest portion of available time. The Harakung-san of the Kalahari, one of the most extensively studied hunter-gatherer groups, were found in classic research from the 1960s by anthropologist Richard Lee to spend an average of approximately 15 to 20 hours per week on food acquisition. 15 to 20 hours. That leaves a substantial majority of waking time for everything else. This finding has been contested and refined over subsequent decades. It varies by season, by environment, by which specific activities are counted as work. But the core point has held up broadly. Hunter-gatherers in conditions of reasonable resource availability do not spend all of their time hunting and gathering. The Hadza of Tanzania, studied more recently, show similar patterns. Adults spending significant portions of the day in rest, social interaction, and activities that cannot be classified as subsistence labor. The Agta of the Philippines show the same. The Ache of Paraguay show the same. This was even more pronounced during periods of abundance. After a successful large hunt, during seasons when plant foods were plentiful, during the relatively long winters of northern climates when harsh weather reduced both the possibility and necessity of extensive travel and hunting. In these periods, ancient humans had substantial amounts of time that was not consumed by immediate survival demands. Time that needed to be filled with something. What filled it tells us everything. Let's talk about what ancient humans did with their unstructured time, because the archaeological record is surprisingly informative on this question. The most spectacular evidence is art. The cave paintings of Chauvet, Lascaux, Altamira, and dozens of other sites across Europe, Africa, and Asia represent an investment of time, skill, and creative effort that cannot be explained by survival necessity. No one needed to paint a cave lion on a limestone wall to survive. The painting of that lion, the selection of the wall, the preparation of the pigments, the lamp-lit journey deep into the cave system, the hours or days of sustained creative work, was discretionary activity. It was something ancient humans chose to do with time that was not consumed by survival. And the quality of it, the extraordinary, repeatedly documented quality of it, tells us something important about boredom and its consequences. The horses at Chauvet are not rudimentary sketches. They are careful, observed, anatomically accurate, dynamically posed representations that required sustained attention, technical skill developed through extensive practice, and a genuine aesthetic sensibility. That skill was developed somewhere. That practice happened over time. Someone, or many someones, spent significant portions of their discretionary time drawing and painting, not just once, but repeatedly, developing their craft across a lifetime of engagement, driven by what can only be described as intrinsic motivation to create and improve. Here is a detail that most people don't know about Chauvet. Some of the paintings were made by the same individual, identified through the handprint analysis at different times, meaning someone returned to the same cave wall, possibly years apart, to continue working. This was not an impulsive afternoon project. This was a sustained, long-term creative commitment. A personal, artistic practice. Something that person came back to when the impulse struck them. When, in other words, they needed something to do. The same logic applies to the musical instruments found at ancient sites. The bone flutes of the Swabian Jura in Germany, The oldest confirmed musical instruments in the archaeological record, dating to approximately 40,000 to 43,000 years ago, were not survival equipment. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. One was made from a griffin vulture wing bone, another from mammoth ivory. They were crafted with precise hole spacing that produces specific musical intervals. Not random holes, but carefully measured, acoustically intentional openings. Someone understood the relationship between hole placement and pitch. That understanding came from experimentation. Experimentation requires time. Specifically the kind of uncommitted exploratory time that boredom produces. Researchers have reconstructed these flutes and played them. They are not primitive noisemakers. They are genuine musical instruments capable of producing melodies. Someone practiced on these instruments long enough to play them well. That practice took hours that were not otherwise claimed by survival demands. Let's talk about something that the archaeological record shows us that is almost always left out of popular discussions of ancient human downtime. Deliberate making of beautiful objects that had no functional requirement to be beautiful. Stone tools had to be sharp. They did not have to be symmetrical, balanced, or aesthetically refined beyond what function required. And yet throughout the ancient archaeological record, going back hundreds of thousands of years, we find tools that are more carefully made than their function demanded. Hand axes that are perfectly symmetrical, finished to a standard that exceeds any functional requirement. Tools made from rare, visually striking materials. Quartz crystals, exotic flints in unusual colors. When functionally equivalent local materials were available. Objects that show, in their making, the unmistakable signature of a maker who cared about the result beyond what utility demanded. There is a famous hand axe found in Swanscombe, England, dating to approximately 400,000 years ago. That contains a fossil shell perfectly centered in the flint. The maker of this tool clearly saw the shell before they began working the stone. They could have napped around it, removing it from the final tool. Instead, they oriented the entire tool around the shell, preserving it at the center of the finished object. This is aesthetic decision-making. Someone, 400,000 years ago, thought the shell made the hand axe more beautiful and chose to keep it. That choice was made in a moment when they had the time and attention to notice the shell, appreciate it, and incorporate it into their work deliberately. That is what a mind with spare capacity does. It notices things. It appreciates things. It makes choices driven by something other than pure efficiency. Let's talk about play. Because play is one of the most direct expressions of what a mind does when it has more capacity than immediate demands require. Play is sometimes described in evolutionary biology as the activity through which young animals develop skills they will need as adults. That is part of the story. But play in humans, including adult humans, goes well beyond skill practice. It is the activity the mind gravitates toward when freed from obligation. It is intrinsically motivated, engaged with for its own sake rather than for any external reward, and characterized by the same quality of absorbed attention that we also see in creative work and in what psychologists call flow states. Ancient children almost certainly played in ways recognizable to any modern child. Running, chasing, mock combat, games with objects, the kind of imaginative narrative play where children create and inhabit fictional scenarios. All of these activities are documented in contemporary hunter-gatherer children and are presumably universal features of human childhood present in the ancient past. But adult play is equally important and equally documented. The competitive physical games. The verbal play of storytelling and humor, the experimental making and doing that sits on the boundary between play and creative work. These were how bored, capable human minds occupied themselves productively in periods of low demand. There is Something specifically interesting here about humor, which is one of the most overlooked dimensions of ancient human social life. Humor requires a mind that can hold two incompatible ideas simultaneously and find the tension between them pleasurable. It requires theory of mind, the ability to model what another person expects so that you can set up and subvert that expectation. It requires the cognitive leisure to engage with ideas that have no practical application. Humor is, in a very precise sense, a product of minds with spare capacity. And the social laughter that humor produces is one of the most powerful bonding mechanisms in human communities. Ancient humans who were funny were almost certainly more socially successful, which means natural selection had reasons to maintain the capacity for humor alongside everything else that makes human cognition so extraordinary. Ancient humans were funny. We cannot prove this from the archaeological record directly, but we can infer it from the same logic we use for everything else. They had the cognitive architecture for it, they had the social contexts that reward it, and every living traditional human society has robust humor traditions. Jokes are as old as language, possibly older. Let's talk about something more specific, the inner life of ancient humans during downtime, because this is where the question of boredom gets philosophically interesting. The default mode network, the brain network that activates when we are not focused on an external task and the mind is left to its own devices, is one of the most distinctively human neural systems. It is the network of mind wandering, of self referential thought, of imagination and planning, and the construction of possible futures and alternative pasts. It is the neural substrate of daydreaming. Ancient humans had this network. It was running in their brains during quiet moments around the fire, during long walks across open landscapes, during the tedious middle portions of hunts where the tracking work is done and you are simply following the signs, waiting for the moment of action. Their minds wandered the same way modern minds wander, into memories, into plans, into imagined scenarios, into the kind of creative rumination that produces new ideas and new approaches to old problems. Research on the default mode network has shown something remarkable. It is most active not during rest in the conventional sense, but during social cognition. Thinking about other people, modeling their minds, navigating the complex landscape of social relationships. Ancient humans living in small, tightly interdependent communities had an extraordinarily rich social landscape to process. The alliances and conflicts, the histories and personalities, the shifting dynamics of a group where everyone knew everyone intimately, processing all of that was cognitively demanding work that the default mode network was doing continuously, even in apparent downtime. In other words, ancient humans sitting quietly around a fire and apparently doing nothing were probably thinking intensely about the people around them, running social simulations, processing recent interactions, planning future ones. The apparent idleness was a cognitive engine running at full capacity on problems that left no physical trace in the archaeological record. Let's talk about innovation, because this is where the story of ancient boredom becomes genuinely consequential. Many of the most significant technological and cultural advances of the ancient human world were almost certainly products of what we might call productive boredom, the directed restlessness of capable minds with time on their hands and the inclination to experiment. Consider the development of hafting technology, the attachment of stone points to wooden shafts to make spears and later arrows. This is not an obvious innovation. It requires understanding that two materials with different properties can be combined to create something better than either alone. Sourcing a binding material like plant resin or sinew, figuring out how to prepare the stone point so it seats properly in the shaft, and developing the specific techniques for securing the binding. None of this could have been figured out in a single urgent moment of need. It required experimentation, trying different approaches, observing results, refining technique across multiple attempts. That experimentation happened in downtime, in the hours when someone had a pile of materials and a working brain and nothing immediately pressing to do. The same is true of the development of ceramic technology, composite tools, rope making, basketry, and a dozen other ancient innovations that transformed human capability. Each of these required a period of exploratory experimentation before it became a reliable technology. That experimentation was only possible because ancient humans had the time for it. There is a concept in innovation research called slack. The idea that creative and technological breakthroughs happen not when resources and time are maximally constrained, but when there is some surplus capacity available for exploration rather than pure exploitation. Ancient boredom was the original slack. It was the resource surplus of time, of attention, of cognitive capacity that made experimentation possible and therefore made innovation possible and therefore made the entire trajectory of human cultural and technological development possible. The capacity for boredom is, at its core, evidence of a mind that expects meaning, a mind that is satisfied with pure survival. Eat, sleep, reproduce, survive. Does not get bored. It is fully engaged by those activities. It has no expectation of anything beyond them. No sense that the present moment is somehow insufficient, no restlessness for something more. The mind that gets bored is a mind that expects more than survival from its existence. It is a mind calibrated, by its own nature, to seek engagement, meaning, novelty, understanding, beauty, connection. Things that are not strictly necessary for biological survival, but that this particular kind of mind will pursue as if they were. The ancient human sitting by the fire who picks up a piece of ochre and starts drawing patterns on a stone is responding to exactly this drive. Not because drawing patterns helps them survive, because their mind, calibrated by evolution to a richer form of engagement with the world than mere survival, finds the absence of that engagement genuinely unpleasant, and responds by creating the engagement itself. Here is the extraordinary part. The meaning seeking that boredom drives was not a side effect of ancient human cognition. It was probably central to why our species succeeded where others didn't. A mind that is never satisfied with the status quo, that is always reaching for something more interesting, more complex, more refined, that mind innovates, it improves, it accumulates. It builds culture that gets richer with every generation because every generation contains people who found the existing version insufficient and pushed it further. The cave paintings, the bone flutes, the fossil-centered hand axe, the hafted spear, the sewn garment more carefully finished than it needed to be. All of it traces back to the same restless, meaning-hungry, magnificently unsatisfied human mind, refusing to sit still when there was something more interesting to be made, or thought, or tried. Ancient humans didn't just get bored, they used their boredom to become the most creatively productive species this planet has ever seen. Every piece of art they left behind, every carefully crafted tool, every musical instrument, every painted wall, all of it is, among other things, a record of what happens when a fully modern human mind has time to spare and refuses to waste it. That tradition didn't end with ancient humans. You're participating in it right now, and you have been your entire life. Every time restlessness drove you towards something worth making or thinking or exploring. The ancient humans would recognize that impulse immediately. It is exactly the one that got them off the ground in the first place.